was a cold, quiet evening, and the world seemed to move in slow motion. In the dim light of a forgotten parking lot, the soft cries of a baby echoed through the still air, breaking the silence like a distant cry for help. Michael Jordan, the basketball legend known for his fierce determination and incredible skill, had just finished a long day. As he walked to his car, grocery bags in hand, he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. His eyes scanned the lot, and then, in the farthest corner, he saw her. Alone, sitting in an old, worn-down car, a mother with a baby wrapped in mismatched blankets, trying to stay warm as the cold night air crept in. What Michael would do next would not only change their lives forever, but it would also challenge everything he knew about compassion and humanity. This wasn't just a chance encounter. It was fate. And it would shock you to see what happens when a legend steps up to help. A glimpse of struggle. The night air was sharp, the kind of crispness that made you feel every breath as it filled your lungs. Michael Jordan, having just completed a rigorous training session, found himself craving the simplest of things. The quiet of his car, the peaceful hum of his engine, the promise of solitude after a day spent pushing his body to its limits. His steps were measured as he walked toward his car, grocery bags in one hand, his mind already starting to let go of the intensity that defined his public life. But then, as if the world had shifted imperceptibly beneath his feet, something caught his eye. At the far end of the parking lot, shrouded in the kind of silence that only comes from desperation, he noticed an old weather-beaten car, its windows clouded with condensation, the kind that comes from living in the cold. The car didn't stand out in the way a sports car or luxury vehicle might, but there was something about it, something in the way it sat there, isolated, as though it had become a forgotten relic of someone's life, abandoned by time itself. At first glance, it seemed like just another vehicle, left behind in an empty parking lot, but Michael couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. The night seemed to pause for just a moment as he took in the scene. His gaze shifted, and he saw her, her face drawn with fatigue, her movements slow, almost as if every step was a battle. She was pushing a shopping cart aside with care, her worn-out clothes barely keeping her warm against the chill. Her eyes darted around nervously, as if she were trying to make herself as invisible as possible in this sprawling, empty space. The exhaustion was evident in her every movement, the slump of her shoulders, the way she clenched the cart as though it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. Michael felt something stir inside him, a knot of empathy and sadness that tightened in his chest. The deeper he looked, the more he noticed. The way her clothes barely protected her from the cold, the ragged blanket she kept bundled up in the car, the faint, heart-wrenching cries of a baby emanating from within the fogged windows. It was clear now. The car wasn't just a vehicle, it was a home. But not the kind of home that offered warmth or safety. This was a home made of desperation, of survival. A home where the cries of a child echoed in the night, unheard by most, but felt deeply by those who dared to look beyond the surface. For a brief moment, Michael's gaze lingered on the car. The scene before him seemed almost surreal, out of place in the otherwise peaceful parking lot. Yet there was nothing remarkable about the situation. It was a reality that many faced, one that was invisible to the world around them. How many others had walked past this woman and her child without a second thought? How many had ignored the quiet despair that surrounded them? As Michael stood there, a weight settled in his chest. The woman's struggle was unspoken but undeniable, and something inside him shifted. He couldn't turn away. He couldn't ignore it. In that fleeting moment, the truth was clear. The story behind this mother and child wasn't just another story. It was their story. And somehow, it was calling out to him. He didn't know what to do next, but he knew he couldn't just leave it at this. He had to act. There was more to this moment than a passing glance. The feeling of helplessness in the pit of his stomach only intensified as he walked to his car, the image of the baby and the mother frozen in his mind. The silence between them spoke volumes. And Michael Jordan, the legend who had faced down countless challenges on the court, realized that this was the real test, the one that demanded more than just a quick fix. This was about human connection, about recognizing the struggle that so many try to hide. And in that moment, Michael understood something. Sometimes, the most important victories don't happen on the court. They happen in the quiet moments of human connection. when we reach out and say, "I see you." The silent conversation. The stillness of the parking lot felt like a weight pressing against Michael, the quiet around him heavy with unspoken truths. He had walked away from the woman's car only moments ago, but something in him told him that he couldn't simply forget what he had seen. His mind wandered back to the baby's soft cries, the subtle vulnerability in the woman's eyes. He couldn't shake the image of her, the way she had stood there, almost invisible, as if she was trying to shield herself from the world that had long since abandoned her. Michael hesitated, standing by his car, torn between the instinct to walk away and the deeper pull inside him that urged him to do more. He had seen suffering before, in many forms, but this was different. It wasn't the kind of pain that could be resolved with a quick gesture, a momentary distraction, or a fleeting conversation. This was the kind of struggle that could only be understood by those who had truly lived through it, who had felt the weight of loss, the isolation of being overlooked. Michael knew in that moment that this woman wasn't just asking for help, she was silently pleading for someone to see her. Not just her situation, not just the visible signs of hardship, but the person she was beneath it all. The human being who had dreams, fears, and hopes that had long since been buried under the weight of survival. After what felt like an eternity, Michael made up his mind. He couldn't leave it there. There was more to this story, more that needed to be said, both for her and for him. He approached slowly, carefully, trying not to startle her, his heart beating in his chest with a rhythm that felt unfamiliar. This wasn't a conversation about small talk or pleasantries. This was a moment that demanded something deeper. "Hi," Michael said softly, his voice warm but cautious. He didn't want to overwhelm her, but he needed to make the connection. "Are you okay? Is there any way I can help?" The woman froze, her eyes widening in surprise. She looked at him briefly, a flicker of vulnerability passing through her gaze before she quickly darted her eyes away, her body stiffening with defensiveness. Michael could see it, the instant wall she had put up to protect herself, to shield herself from a world that had taken so much from her. She didn't want to be seen, she didn't want to be exposed, and yet, somehow, she was. "No, I'm fine, thank you," she replied, her tone sharp but not entirely dismissive. It was the kind of response that was meant to end the conversation, to keep things at a safe distance. But Michael could sense the underlying tension in her voice, the unsaid words that lingered between them. He paused, sensing that pushing further might only make her retreat, yet there was an undeniable pull, a force that urged him to reach out even further, to not let this be the end of their interaction. "Okay, I understand," he said softly, his voice carrying no judgment, just understanding. "If you need anything, I'll be around." With that, the woman turned, her movements hurried, almost automatic, as she retreated back to her car. Michael stood there for a moment, watching her as she slid into the driver's seat. The way she held herself, her shoulders tight, her face drawn with exhaustion, it was clear that she was carrying a burden too heavy to bear alone. And for a brief, fleeting second, Michael felt the weight of her struggle, as though it were his own. As he turned to leave, his gaze flickered back to the car. Through the fogged windows he saw it, the silhouette of a baby, shifting slightly in her arms. His chest tightened. The sight was a reminder that her struggle was not just hers alone. She was fighting for her child. And that made everything in Michael's heart ache. For a moment he stood frozen, as though something within him had snapped into focus. This wasn't just a momentary act of kindness he could easily walk away from. This was a situation that demanded more. It wasn't about offering a quick fix or a simple solution. It was about acknowledging the depth of her pain, the quiet strength it took for her to survive in the shadows, to carry on in a world that seemed to have forgotten her. Michael knew in that instant that the encounter was far from over. The conversation wasn't finished, it had only just begun. A second look. The weight of the previous encounter lingered in Michael's mind long after he had driven away from the parking lot. That moment, brief and seemingly inconsequential to the world around him, had grown heavier with each passing hour. The image of the mother, hunched over in her car, with her baby wrapped in thin blankets, haunted him. It wasn't just the desperation in her eyes. It was the quiet, almost imperceptible way she had withdrawn from the world. Michael understood that kind of isolation. He had felt it before, not in the same circumstances, but in the solitude that came with fame, the feeling of being constantly watched, yet never truly seen. It was hard to shake the thought that there was more to her story, something deeper than what met the eye. It was clear that she wasn't asking for charity, not in the way many would. She was asking for something far more profound. She was asking for understanding, for recognition. Michael could sense that behind her guarded exterior, beneath the rough edges of survival, there was a person who had once had hopes and dreams, someone who had experienced loss and heartbreak, but who, for whatever reason, had been left behind. The following morning, Michael found himself thinking of her once more. He couldn't leave things unresolved. He couldn't just go back to his routine, pretending that the echoes of her situation would fade. No. He needed to know if she was still there, if there was more he could do. The thought of walking away, of ignoring her suffering, felt wrong. The world could wait. He knew that he had to return. When he parked in the same spot, his eyes immediately scanned the parking lot. His heart sank as he saw the familiar old car, still parked in the same corner, the fogged-up windows, the clothes hanging inside. Everything looked exactly as it had the night before, but this time, there was something different. There, in the distance, was the woman. She was carrying a plastic bag, and Michael could see the exhaustion on her face as she walked toward the car. He took a deep breath, his chest tightening with a mix of anxiety and resolve. This was it. He had to approach her again, not just out of obligation, but because something inside him refused to let her remain invisible. He had already seen too much, and now he was committed to being there for her, however he could. But this time, he would not just offer more supplies. He would offer something she could trust, a quiet acknowledgement that her pain mattered. Michael grabbed the bottle of water and the new blanket he had brought from home. He walked toward her car with slow, deliberate steps, keeping his presence unthreatening. When he reached the car, he placed the items carefully on the hood, ensuring they were visible yet unobtrusive. It was a small gesture, one that didn't demand a thank you or any kind of recognition, but Michael knew it might mean something more to her than just the items themselves. Without saying a word, he turned and walked back to his car, giving her the space to make her own decision. He had done enough. But as he sat in his car, his eyes remained trained on her, waiting to see what she would do. The minutes stretched on in silence. The weight of this simple interaction felt more profound than any game or victory he had ever experienced. This wasn't about performance or spectacle. It was about real human connection, the kind that doesn't need applause or recognition to be meaningful. A few moments later, the woman opened the car door, hesitantly peering at the items on the hood. She looked around, her eyes searching for the source of the gift, but Michael remained still, silent in his car, watching from a distance. Her eyes locked onto the bottle of water first, and then to the blanket. The hesitation in her movements spoke volumes. She was used to living without help, used to surviving on her own, and the notion that someone had noticed her, had cared enough to leave something, seemed almost foreign to her. Finally, with a quiet, reluctant gesture, she reached out, picking up the water bottle first, then the blanket. She didn't speak, but Michael noticed her lips moving, her silent words lost to the wind. He couldn't hear them, but he could feel them. Feel the gratitude, the conflict, the vulnerability in that small action. She had accepted the help, and that, for Michael, was enough. As he started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, he felt a strange mixture of relief and frustration. He had done something, yes, but he knew that it wasn't enough. The road ahead for her was long, and the pain she carried wasn't going to be erased by a blanket and a bottle of water. But at least just for a moment, he had been part of her story, offering a brief respite from the loneliness she had grown accustomed to. And in that moment, Michael realized that it wasn't the grand gestures that truly mattered. It was the small, quiet acts of humanity that could make a difference in the lives of those who felt unseen, and sometimes that was enough to change everything. The small breakthrough. The morning sunlight filtered through the canopy of trees above the parking lot, casting soft rays onto the pavement. Michael Jordan sat in his car, his eyes glued to the familiar corner of the lot where the old sedan had parked again. The previous evening's small but significant gesture seemed to be lingering in his thoughts. The woman, Emily, had accepted the water and the blanket, but Michael knew the journey they had started together wasn't over. It wasn't enough to simply offer help. No, this situation was deeper, more complex, and far more personal than that. He had seen it in her eyes, the same guarded expression that he himself had worn at various times in his life. That self-protection, that refusal to show weakness, even when all the signs pointed to vulnerability. She had been through something unimaginable, something that had scarred her deeply, and in the moments when Michael had watched her, it became clear to him that the pain Emily carried went far beyond homelessness. It was a burden of loss, of grief, of fear, the kind of weight that no one should have to carry alone. As Michael stepped out of the car, he could feel the familiar weight of the situation settle onto his shoulders. The cool morning air seemed to only add to the heaviness of it all. But there was something else there, too, a quiet anticipation. He wasn't sure what would happen when he approached Emily again. Would she let him in? Would she still see him as just a stranger, a passerby who had shown her a fleeting act of kindness only to disappear again, or had something shifted, even slightly? He watched as Emily appeared in the distance, walking toward her car. She was carrying a small plastic bag again, her eyes cast downward, her shoulders hunched as if the weight of the world rested on them. Michael knew it wasn't just physical exhaustion she was carrying. It was the emotional toll of surviving in a world that had largely forgotten her. This time, he didn't just want to offer more supplies. No, this time, he wanted to connect on a deeper level, to acknowledge her story, to show her that she wasn't invisible, to let her know that in this vast, cold world, there was at least one person who cared enough to reach out. "Hey," Michael called gently as he approached. "It's me again. I wanted to check in and make sure you're okay." Emily froze for a moment, her posture stiffening with the same defensiveness he had seen before. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but there was something in them now. Something different. Less distrust, more curiosity, even if it was just a flicker. "I'm the one who left the blanket and the water yesterday," Michael continued, his voice steady and soft. "I hope you didn't feel uncomfortable with that. I just wanted to help." There was a pause. Emily's face, still worn with the exhaustion of her circumstances, softened just slightly. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet but edged with suspicion. Michael took a small step back, allowing her space to decide whether or not she wanted to engage further. "I saw you here yesterday, and I thought maybe you needed something. Anything, really." He shrugged lightly, as if the gesture had been instinctive. "You don't have to talk to me. I understand if you don't want to. But sometimes it's okay to let someone help." Emily didn't respond immediately. She didn't thank him, and she didn't deny him either. Instead, she simply looked at him, her expression torn between gratitude and something else. Fear, maybe. Fear of letting someone in. Michael didn't rush her. He waited for her to process the words, to let the silence between them speak for itself. Then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. Emily's rigid posture relaxed, just a fraction. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, "for the water and the blanket." Her words, though quiet, were a small victory for Michael. They were more than just a polite acknowledgement. They were a crack in the walls she had built around herself, a willingness to accept kindness, even if it was hard. And that meant something. But as Michael stood there, about to leave, he heard it, the soft, muffled cry of a baby from inside the car. The sound was faint but unmistakable. His heart clenched. He couldn't ignore it, not now. "Do you need anything for him?" Michael asked, his voice gentle but urgent. "Formula, diapers, whatever you might need." Emily's face tightened, her eyes flickering with the weight of unspoken pain. She hesitated for a moment, her lips trembling as though the words were stuck. Finally, in a voice so soft it was barely audible, she spoke. I need milk," she said, almost apologetically. Michael's heart broke at the quiet surrender in her voice. This was the turning point, the moment when she stopped trying to shoulder it all on her own, when she allowed herself to admit that she couldn't do everything by herself. Michael nodded, understanding how hard it must have been for her to ask for help. "Okay," he said, his voice filled with reassurance. "I'll be right back." Without waiting for her reply, he turned and rushed into the supermarket, his mind already racing with the list of things he needed to bring. As he returned, carrying a bag filled with formula, diapers, and baby wipes, he could sense the subtle change in the air. Emily was no longer as closed off. There was a vulnerability in her eyes now, a softness that hadn't been there before. When Michael handed her the bag, she took it hesitantly, her fingers brushing against his as she accepted it. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Michael smiled, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had just witnessed. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice warm but firm. "I'm just glad I could help." As he walked back to his car, the faint sound of the baby's cries still echoing in his mind, he felt a strange sense of fulfillment. This wasn't the end of their story, not by a long shot, but it was a beginning, a small breakthrough, a moment when two strangers had crossed paths and just for a moment found connection. And sometimes that was all it took to change a life. A conversation. The days that followed seemed to stretch on forever for Michael Jordan, the memory of Emily and her baby, Oliver, remaining in the back of his mind like an unfinished story. Each time he returned to the parking lot, the weight of their situation pressed down on him. He could see Emily from a distance, her movements slower than before, the exhaustion settling deeper into her bones. Yet, despite her isolation, there was something in her demeanor that began to shift. A slight change in the way she carried herself, less tense, and more willing to acknowledge the world around her. Michael knew that the quiet moments he shared with her were more than simple acts of charity. They were moments of connection, of understanding, and that was something deeper than a quick fix. It was the hardest part of helping someone, he realized, offering them the space to heal without pushing them to open up before they were ready. He had already seen how she fought her inner battles in silence. It wasn't just the need for supplies. It was the silent plea for acknowledgement, for someone to listen, for someone to see her beyond the circumstances she had found herself in. One evening, as he parked his car in the same spot as before, Michael noticed her once again. She was sitting in front of the car, holding Oliver gently in her arms. The weight of the world seemed to have settled in her eyes, but there was a different kind of exhaustion now, less about survival, more about the quiet despair of feeling lost. Michael's chest tightened. He knew that this wasn't just about material things anymore. It wasn't about the blanket or the water. It was about her soul. It was about reaching through the walls she had built around herself, walls constructed by pain and fear, and offering her the one thing she might not have asked for, the freedom to speak her truth. Taking a deep breath, Michael approached cautiously, his movements slow, purposeful. He didn't want to disturb her, but he didn't want to leave without trying to connect more deeply. "Hey," he said softly, his voice calm but filled with concern. "Can I sit with you for a while?" Emily looked up, startled at first, as though she hadn't expected anyone to ask. Her eyes held a quiet wariness, but this time there was a flicker of something else, something he hadn't seen before. Curiosity. Hesitation. A slight release of the guarded shell she had worn so long. After a moment of silence, she nodded, the briefest acknowledgement. Michael sat beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance, his legs stretched out in front of him as he looked at the sky, letting the quiet settle between them. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Sometimes the silence spoke louder than words ever could. Michael wasn't in a rush. He wasn't here to fix her or to offer solutions. He was here to listen, to be present, in the only way he knew how. "You don't have to talk about anything you're not ready to," Michael said, breaking the silence softly. "But I do want you to know, whatever you're going through, you don't have to go through it alone." Emily remained silent, her eyes focused on the ground as her fingers traced the edges of Oliver's blanket. Michael could sense the weight of the silence, the tension that lingered, and he knew she wasn't ready to share her story completely. But there was something in the way she relaxed, just a little, as if his words had planted a seed of trust. A tiny opening for her to let someone else in. After a long pause, Emily spoke, her voice almost inaudible. "It feels like I'm invisible," she whispered, barely meeting Michael's gaze. "Like no one sees me, not really, and sometimes I wonder, if I could just disappear, would anyone even notice?" Her words hit Michael with the force of a punch. He had been prepared for many things, anything from anger to indifference, but not this. Not the raw honesty in her voice, the depth of her pain that had been hidden beneath the surface for so long. She wasn't just hiding from the world, she was hiding from herself, trying to protect herself from the emotional devastation of feeling forgotten, abandoned. Michael's heart ached for her. He knew what it felt like to be in the public eye, to have the world watching but never truly seeing you. He understood the isolation that came with being admired for what you did, not who you were. And he couldn't imagine the depth of Emily's loneliness. "You're not invisible to me," Michael said gently, his voice firm but compassionate. "I see you, and I want you to know that you matter. You're important. I may not know your story completely, but I'm here. I'm listening. And I'm not going anywhere." Emily's eyes filled with a mix of disbelief and tentative hope. For the first time in what must have been a long while, she allowed herself to believe that someone truly cared, not for the person she used to be, but for the person she was right now. Broken, vulnerable, and full of pain, yet still fighting for the future of her child. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet the vulnerability in it was palpable. "I don't know how to keep going when everything feels like it's falling apart." Michael paused, choosing his words carefully. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now. None of us do. The important thing is that you're still here, still fighting. And that's more than a lot of people can say. You're stronger than you think." For the first time, Michael saw a flicker of relief in Emily's eyes, a small shift in her posture, as if the weight of her emotions had been acknowledged, even if only for a brief moment. She didn't have to carry it all alone anymore. "You don't have to do this by yourself," Michael added softly, his voice steady with sincerity. "We'll figure this out together." In that instant, a quiet bond had formed between them, one built on shared humanity, empathy, and the understanding that sometimes the hardest battles are fought not in isolation, but in the willingness to trust another soul to share the burden. The truth behind the struggle. The days seemed to bleed into each other for Emily, each one a reflection of the one before it, a relentless cycle of survival and sacrifice. But there was a subtle shift that Michael had noticed, a change in her eyes, a slight release of the armor she had been wearing for so long. He had given her space, allowed her the time she needed to come to terms with the idea that help wasn't something to fear or to reject. It was an offering, a lifeline, but it wasn't enough. Michael knew that. He couldn't help but feel that the silence between them still held 1,000 unspoken words. The connection between them had grown stronger, but there were still pieces of her story left untold, fragments of pain that she had yet to share, the kind of pain that ran deeper than the surface, the kind of pain that shaped a person's soul, built walls around their heart to protect themselves from the cruel reality of the world. And Michael knew if she was ever going to heal, those walls had to come down. It would take time, but it had to start somewhere. One afternoon, when Michael returned to the parking lot, something felt different. Emily was sitting outside the car, cradling Oliver in her arms, her eyes distant, as if lost in a memory. The weight of the world seemed to hang on her every move, and Michael could feel it. He knew it was time. It was time for her to share her story, her truth. The truth behind the struggle that had led her to this place. He approached her slowly, not wanting to intrude, but knowing that this was the moment when everything could change. "Hey, Emily," he said gently, his voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking about you, about how things are going." She looked up at him, her gaze meeting his for the first time without the walls of defensiveness. There was something in her eyes, something raw and fragile. A flicker of trust, perhaps. For the first time, she didn't pull away, didn't retreat into herself. Instead, she looked at him as though searching for the courage to say what had been building up inside her for so long. "It's not just about being out here in this car," Emily said, her voice trembling as she spoke. "It's about everything that led me here, everything that I lost. I don't know how to make sense of it all." Her eyes fell to the ground as though the weight of her words was too much to carry. "I used to have everything, a family, a home, a life, and then it all just fell apart. Michael could hear the pain in her voice, the cracks in the surface, and he stayed silent, giving her the space to continue. He could see how hard it was for her to talk about it. This wasn't just about being homeless, this was about grief, loss, the invisible wounds that ran so deep that words couldn't capture them. "I lost my husband," Emily continued, her voice barely audible, as if speaking the words aloud made them more real. "He was coming home from work one night. It was just supposed to be another regular night, nothing special. But then the police showed up at my door. They said he didn't suffer, but that didn't matter. He was gone, just like that. And everything changed." Michael's heart clenched. He didn't need to ask for more details. He could hear the suffocating weight of her grief in those few words. The sudden, tragic loss of her husband had upended her world. But that wasn't the only loss she had suffered. Emily's voice wavered as she spoke again, the hurt still fresh in her eyes. "I couldn't afford the bills after he was gone. The life insurance didn't cover enough. I tried to keep it together for Oliver, but everything kept slipping away. And then his parents, they said I wasn't fit to take care of him. They said I wasn't stable enough, and they filed for custody. It felt like they were taking everything from me." Her eyes brimmed with unshed tears, but she quickly blinked them away, not wanting to seem weak. Michael felt a pang of anger, a deep sense of injustice. He couldn't imagine the pain Emily must have felt, being torn between the grief of losing her husband and the fight to keep her son. And now she was here, in this parking lot, doing everything she could to hold on to the only thing left, her child. "I didn't have enough money for a lawyer, and when I realized I couldn't win, I packed up whatever I could and just left. I thought I could start over, find work, get back on my feet, but things didn't get better, they got worse." Emily's voice faltered as she spoke, the weight of her failures pressing down on her chest. "I worked at a cafe for a while, saved some money, but then a customer started harassing me. I tried to explain to my boss, but he didn't care. He fired me, just like that. And then it all fell apart. No job, no home, and now this." She gestured to the car around them, her face filled with a quiet despair. Michael sat in stunned silence, the enormity of her story crashing over him like a wave. She wasn't just a woman living in a car. She wasn't just a homeless mother. She was a woman who had been beaten down by life, who had fought for everything she had only to see it all slip away in an instant. She was a woman who had lost her husband, lost her dignity, lost her sense of security, and who now fought each day to protect the only thing she had left, her son. For the first time, Michael truly understood. This wasn't about helping her because she was homeless. This was about helping her reclaim the parts of herself that had been buried under the weight of loss and shame. This was about restoring her belief that she deserved more than just survival. She deserved to live, to heal, to find hope again. Michael reached over and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Emily," he said quietly, his voice filled with compassion. "You've been through so much, and I want you to know you don't have to do this alone. We'll get through this together, whatever it takes." In that moment, Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know how things would change, or if they would ever truly get better, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope. There was a way out of the darkness, and it began with the simple truth. She didn't have to fight alone anymore. Opening up. The night had fallen quietly around them, the dark sky a blanket over the world, but Emily's thoughts felt like they were in turmoil. The world outside seemed so far away, as if her entire existence had become confined to the small, cramped car, the shelter that had become her home. But tonight, there was something different about the air. Something more hopeful, a quiet shift in her soul that she couldn't quite explain. For the first time, she felt like someone truly understood her. Someone had seen her for who she was, beyond the dirt, the exhaustion, the walls she had spent years building to keep the world at bay. Michael had sat with her, not as someone offering pity, but as someone genuinely wanting to understand her story, to be there. He had seen her. He had truly seen her. And that made all the difference. Her heart still ached with the weight of the past, The loss of her husband, the pain of losing custody of her son, the constant battle for survival that had driven her to this point. But there was a part of her, buried deep, that longed to believe in something better, to believe that her story didn't have to end here, that there was more to her than just the labels of homeless or mother in need. She was more than that. She had dreams, desires, a life that deserved to be lived. She just needed a spark, someone to help her reignite the fire within. Michael's words had opened a door she had long since locked. "I'm here," he had said. "You're not alone." It was such a simple thing, yet the truth of it washed over her like a balm to a deep wound she hadn't even known she was still carrying. She had been fighting alone for so long, fighting to protect her son, to keep everything together, that she had forgotten what it felt like to truly let someone in. As she cradled Oliver in her arms that night, the weight of his tiny form in her embrace seemed to ground her, to remind her of the preciousness of life, even in its most broken moments. She couldn't let him grow up in this constant struggle, in this world that had so easily cast her aside. And yet, she had never known how to escape it, how to build a new life when the old one had crumbled in front of her eyes. How could she ever dream of something more, when everything she had worked for had slipped through her fingers? But tonight, as Michael's presence seemed to offer a quiet kind of solace, Emily realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to let herself hope again. She had been living in a constant state of survival, too afraid to ask for help, too proud to accept it when offered. But Michael had offered something different, a connection, a true understanding that didn't feel like charity, but like human. And with that understanding came the courage to share the most painful part of her story. "I've been fighting for so long," she said quietly, her voice trembling as the words began to spill out. "Fighting to keep it together, to keep Oliver safe. But sometimes it feels like I'm just treading water, barely staying afloat. I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know how to fix it." Michael listened, his eyes soft, his expression full of compassion. He didn't rush her or offer empty reassurances. He simply allowed her the space to speak, to express the weight of her struggle, and in that moment Emily realized something she had forgotten along the way. It was okay to not have all the answers. It was okay to ask for help. It was okay to admit that she couldn't do it all on her own. "I don't know where to start," she whispered, her voice raw. "But I can't keep pretending like everything is fine. I can't keep pretending like I'm not breaking inside. I need help. I don't know where to turn, but I need something. Someone." The words were painful to speak, but once they left her lips, they felt like the first step toward healing. She didn't have to carry the weight of the world on her own anymore. She could let others in, even if it was just one person, even if it was just Michael. He had shown her that it was possible to trust again, to open her heart to the possibility of a future. Michael reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said gently. "One step at a time. And I'll be here every step of the way. We'll figure it out together." His words, so simple yet so profound, gave Emily the courage to face the future, whatever it might hold. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Maybe this wasn't the end of her story, but the beginning of something new. The tears that had been threatening to fall for so long finally came. But this time they weren't just tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of finally letting go of the burden she had carried alone for so long. And as she cried, Michael sat with her, offering the quiet comfort of presence, of understanding. It wasn't about solving everything. It was about being there, about showing her that she wasn't invisible anymore. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emily allowed herself to feel something more than pain. She felt hope, and that was a feeling she hadn't known in a long, long time. As Emily's story unfolds, we are reminded of the strength it takes to share our struggles, the power of connection, and the hope that can arise even in the darkest of times. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to join our community and become a part of this journey toward healing, hope, and support. Please, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you never miss an uplifting story like Emily's, one that shows the power of kindness, empathy, and shared humanity. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful stories to life. Also, comment below and share your thoughts. Whether you have your own story of overcoming adversity, or just want to express how this story moved you. I'd love to hear from you and keep the conversation going. You are not alone, and together, we can create a space where every voice is heard.